It's now my great pleasure to invite Philip Spencer to give the second presentation.
Well, thanks very much. That's quite a tall order to follow that. Very compelling. I just want to say a couple of words very quickly at the beginning. The first is that I'm a member of the generation that Dave was just talking about. So I come out of the 60s. So I know this group of people very well, sadly. The second thing is, I'm very sad that David Hirsch isn't going to be here. It's nice that you're going to be giving his talk. I spoke at great length to David on Friday, and I'm actually happy to take any questions on his paper, because I know what he said, and I know exactly how he thinks. But of course, I'll tell him when I lied. Okay, the British problem. The problem basically is why and how has the British Labour Party, historically the home for Jewish voters and activists, become a space within which anti-Semitic attitudes and views can be easily promoted and circulated? There is a lot of debate about this, and it takes a lot of different forms. And much of the work, and Dave here has been a real pioneer in this, a leading voice in this, as has David Hirsch, has gone into dealing with this as a British problem, as a local or conjunctural problem to do with the particular phenomenon of Corbynism. And the approach I want to take is not antithetical to this, but complementary to it. I want to widen the angle of vision and place this problem in a slightly longer historical perspective, but with a particular focus on the question of solidarity with Jews, or its absence. And it's a complicated question, because I think we have to think about two different traditions. One is the tradition that Corbyn and his supporters come from, and there is another. And if I can just give a quick plug, I wrote a book about these two traditions with my late friend Robert Fine. And when I started working on that book with Robert about 6 years ago, not in my wildest dreams did I think we would be where we are now. In the book, we explored different ways in which the left, and not just in Britain, has thought about and responded to anti-Semitism. We went back to the Enlightenment, the 18th century, and traced these two traditions through, the 19th and the 20th, and now the 21st century. And we looked in particular at the construction by many on the left, and for many on the left, of a supposed Jewish question, in which, despite the generous emancipation by some states of the Jews, never total of course, Jews still came to be seen to pose a continuing problem for society, for the forces of progress variously conceived, for a number of reasons. And this is not an exhaustive list, but these to me are the key ones. Firstly, Jews remain a problem because they can insist on clinging to an outdated set of beliefs and customs. In the Enlightenment, Judaism was seen as more outdated than Christianity and even more outdated than Islam because it wasn't universalist. Secondly, that Jews continue to exaggerate their bad treatment by others and repeatedly engage in special pleading to make others feel sorry for them or guilty. And thirdly, they do this for malign purposes, to gain advantages over others. And fourthly, in political terms, they maintain loyalty to their own group over and above others. Especially now in the emergence of new states, new nation states, they remain concerned with themselves primarily and not with their fellow citizens. So even in the French Revolution, you find the person promoting the emancipation of Jews, Count Clermont-Tonnerre, saying Jews shouldn't remain a nation within a nation. In addition, there were economic concerns that Jews engaged in the worst kinds of behavior, usury, and in social terms because they continued to stick with each other and isolate themselves from the rest of society. Now, this led on the left to a politics in which anti-Semitism came to be seen by some, not by everybody, as understandable or condonable, and even something that could be harnessed to the socialist cause, what one of the leaders of German social democracy, August Bebel, though he didn't invent the term, called the socialism of fools. Anti-Semitism was understandable or condonable for a number of reasons. Firstly, and here the parallel becomes clear, Jews were still clinging to an outdated set of particularist beliefs and customs which were at variance with the progressive universalist doctrine of socialism. Secondly, the political expression of this particularism was Zionism, was therefore inherently and intrinsically from the beginning a reactionary force, demanding a state for which Jews had no rights, since Jews did not constitute a nation, having no shared language or territory of their own. Thirdly, that Jewish suffering was no longer significant in the modern world, but was only a relic of the past. So for Jews to call attention to it was by definition to exaggerate its contemporary significance and to engage in special pleading. The alternative, therefore, promoted by this tradition on the left, was for Jews to assimilate fully, socially and especially politically into the socialist movement and into the nation states which had now given them full citizenship. The argument here was that under these circumstances, given this offer, if Jews continued with their particularism and their special pleading and their malign behavior, anti-Semitism was understandable. It was explicable. And this way of thinking profoundly affected ways in which many of the left, but not all of it, failed to respond to anti-Semitism precisely as it became more radical, precisely as it became genocidal, and precisely before and during and after the Holocaust. And it led to a limited solidarity. And this is very important for us to think about, because there is an enormous mythology about the left's solidarity with Jews before, during, and after the Holocaust. And Corbyn himself promotes this myth repeatedly, telling everybody that he has no anti-Semitic bone in his body, wherever such a bone may be located, because his mother was at Cable Street, one of the great moments of solidarity with Jews. But the problem with Cable Street is it stands out as an exception, not the rule. So when we look at the record of the organised left, and by the organised left I do not mean every single person on the left, and the chair of this meeting has written a wonderful book about solidarity with Jews by individuals and networks. What I'm talking about is the organised political movements of the left, the dominant forces. In Germany, before the Holocaust and during the Holocaust, there was no major organised effort to express solidarity with Jews. There was opposition to the Nazis, there was opposition to fascism, but that isn't necessarily the same thing as opposition to anti-Semitism. And you can see in German social democracy and in the Communist Party a great reluctance to take up what was being done to the Jews. And this is also true for the often communist-led resistance throughout Europe, particularly, for example, in France, where the resistance, dominated by the communists, was very reluctant to take up the Jewish question. And of particular significance, of course, is the Soviet Union, to which so many on the left looked for so long. The Soviet Union moved from downplaying the Holocaust at the time to repressing recognition of what had happened to the Jews as such after the event, to immediately after the event developing and generating its own form of anti-Semitism. I say developing because the roots of this were already clear in the 20s and 30s. And in this campaign, Jews were attacked amazingly for being simultaneously cosmopolitans and Zionists. Now, this is an obvious contradiction, since if you're a cosmopolitan, you can't be a nationalist, and if you're a Zionist, you can't be a cosmopolitan. But Jews managed to be both in the Soviet imagination. What connects them is that cosmopolitanism is about insufficient loyalty to the construction of socialism in the Soviet Union, and Zionism is about loyalty to another state. Now, the reason for all of this is that contemporary anti-Zionism was forged in this crucible. What is extraordinary is how much of the anti-Zionism that dominates the British left, and I think goes much further than Britain, comes out of this frame of reference. And it's led to the kind of common sense that Dave talked about, which does not recognize the legitimacy of a state which was constructed for Jews after the Holocaust, after an experience in which the left had not given sustained and systematic support to Jews. So whatever anyone thinks of the current policies of the Israeli government or past Israeli governments, the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of Jews in Britain and globally do think that after the Holocaust, Israel is a legitimate state and a haven for Jews. And those on the left who can't recognize that feeling have to think about the absence of solidarity that predated the emergence of that state and don't. Now, I want to suggest that all of this background, throws some light on recent developments in Britain, but they may be of much wider significance than what happened in Britain last summer, which was a major debate about how to think about the Holocaust and Israel and anti-Semitism. And Dave referenced it in his talk about the IHRA definition of the Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, which is very widely adopted in Britain, right across the country, including by Labour councils, but the Labour leadership under Corbyn did not want to adopt it. In that definition, a series of examples were given of what anti-Semitism could look like, and they included 4 things: accusing Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Secondly, accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nation. Thirdly, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And lastly, by drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Corbyn and his advisors tried to rewrite this definition, and in particular the Israeli-related points, and remove the charge especially that Israel, the state of Israel, is per se a racist endeavor. Why? Because he and they actually do think the following. Firstly, that Jews do exaggerate the Holocaust, that they engage in special pleading, and they do so for malign and self-interested purposes. Secondly, that Jews place a particularist loyalty to Israel above the interests of their own nations, and the interests of their own nations run counter to the interests of Israel. Thirdly, that Jews anyway do not have any right to self-determination because they do not form and cannot form a nation, and certainly not in a land that belongs to a supposedly indigenous people who have been dispossessed and violently suppressed by Jewish settler colonialists. And fourthly, in any case, the way that Jews choose to think about themselves as a nation is inherently and intrinsically outdated and reactionary in the modern world, because it rests uniquely on racist and ethnic assumptions that the rest of the world, apparently, has supposedly outgrown. So once again, Jews are clinging to an outdated set of beliefs and customs. And what follows, therefore, is that it is quite reasonable to compare the Israeli state to the Nazis, and even to see Zionism as the worst kind of racism, an ideology which has led to the appalling crime of apartheid, now designated as a crime against humanity in international law. Whatever the specifically British context then, or the particular circumstances in which Corbyn has been placed in the position he now holds, there is also then this longer-term frame of reference which goes beyond a purely British context. It derives from a particular way of thinking about Jews on the left, which even when Jews faced their greatest danger in the Holocaust, weakened organised solidarity with them. But this is not the only tradition on the left. So I want to defend my past, because it isn't the only way to think about why people become socialists in the first place, or became socialists. Older people like me, or even some of the younger people who don't understand the tradition they're being sucked into in this respect. In terms of ideas, one can trace a very different tradition, which rejects and has always rejected in the modern world, since the Enlightenment, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, the idea that Jews exaggerate their suffering, the idea that Jews do so for malign purposes, the idea that Jews alone cannot form a nation, the idea that a Jewish idea of a nation state is necessarily, inherently, and intrinsically more reactionary than that of others. And above all, that takes the Holocaust seriously as an event that changed everything. In the book, we trace this tradition through the centuries, but I want to place particular emphasis on the Holocaust in all this, because it involves a direct rebuttal of at least 4 key tenets of the Corbynite approach, inasmuch, if I'm right, as it rests on the construction of a supposed Jewish question. Firstly, the Holocaust cannot be exaggerated by anyone and especially by Jews, because it was an extremely radical genocidal project that attempted to remove Jews not just from one place, not just from Germany, not just from Europe, but from the world. Once you do that, you're in a different place. The Nazi project was a global project which attacked Jews and here we come to the question of the connection between Jews and everybody else, everybody. Because if you eliminate a group, you change our understanding of humanity itself. Secondly, the question of solidarity, and especially its absence, is key. In a world of nation states, Jews had discovered that they could not find protection from the violence of their fellow citizens in Germany, in Europe, and further, including solidarity from others on the left, and so felt the need, which most Jews, the overwhelming majority of Jews, feel today, for a state of their own. And not to recognize this is a catastrophic political and ethical mistake. To invoke socialism in this context as an alternative to Zionism is not only rhetorical, but grotesquely ironic. Thirdly, that Jews should feel a special concern for their fellow Jews in the State of Israel, the focus of the dual loyalty charge, needs to be thought out as a consequence in particular of a major development of the Holocaust, which is, where do Jews now live? They live now primarily in 3 places. Here, in the United States, in Europe, diminishingly, and in Israel. Precisely because of the Holocaust. And lastly, and I'll stop on this, the depiction of Jews as Nazis turns reality on its head in a way that Marx would have recognized. That's what ideology is. It turns the world upside down. And as always with constructions of a Jewish question, it tells us nothing about actual real Jews, but everything about anti-Semites.